All right, chapter two, chapter two of the Screw Tape Letters. Uh, he kind of opens with saying, "All right, we just covered some stuff, some important stuff, the foundation of morality in chapter one. But before we move on from that, we need to make sure that we address people's objections so that we're all kind of on the same page." So he said, I regularly hear two objections. The first is, okay, what you call morality is really just an instinct, herd instinct, kind of like these sheep here that are just instinctually running with everyone else. And so what you're describing as this absolute morality that's outside of a person, it's really just the collection of humanity kind of running in the same direction. He says the other objection, for those that don't make that argument, they say something to the effect of society has simply brainwashed us into thinking that morality is absolute. Maybe it's not an instinctual thing, but over time, society, all of humanity just kind of agrees, or at least pockets of humanity come up with kind of rules that they all agree on, and so that's why we think that morality is absolute, just because we look around and see that everyone else has the same idea, but the only reason they have the same idea is because they're surrounded by everyone else, and so they're all this mob mentality. So he addresses them one at a time. Let's look at the first one. He says, while we definitely, we truly are products of the environments or society that we grow up in, an instinct is different than what he's describing here as morality. An instinct is just like a strong impulse or desire to act in a certain way. And he gives some examples. A mother's love, it's just kind of this instinctual thing. You just feel this bond or connection with your child, typically. Sexual instinct that we are just naturally aroused and drawn to the other sex. And then the instinct for food, that we feel hunger pains and we're like, I need food. I want some food. I'm going to get food. And these are things that we just impulsively feel. We don't have to work on them or strive for them. No one says, I guess I better eat. No, we just naturally want to eat when we feel those hunger pangs. So, an instinct, it's not your conscience making you feel guilty, like you should do something. I really should eat. I feel guilty. I'm racked with guilt that I haven't eaten today. Or, no one is racked with guilt. There's no instinctive feeling of, oh, I should really love, I shouldn't be mean to my child. That's not, you wouldn't call that an instinct. And he kind of illustrates this with three different points or three different ways of looking at it. So the first, so okay, you hear someone screaming. Let's say they're drowning, and you have two kind of conflicting, or not necessarily conflicting instincts. One is, the pressure of society saying that you really, yeah, I want to help. I want to be the hero. Society has shown me and taught me that it's important to help people, so I'm feeling a tug in that direction. So maybe I'm going to go help. But you also have that instinctive self-preservation thing pulling you the other way, saying, I don't know, that might be dangerous. What if you start drowning? So we have two competing desires here. The desire to help, to be a hero, to help someone, and the desire to not get our clothes wet, to stay safe, to protect our own lives, self-preservation. He said, but there's kind of something that comes down into the scenario and inserts itself and gives a preference to one of those two sides. In this case, most of the time, you're going to see something leading you to move in the help direction. And what is that? He said it's not an instinct. Again, an instinct is a strong desire, an impulse. This is not a desire necessarily. This is like, I really should do this. I should help the person. It would be right for me to do that. So he said calling that an instinct doesn't make a whole lot of sense. This tug of war that's going on inside of us. That doesn't make sense. We are feeling not an impulse, but a value judgment that the right thing to do would be to help the person drowning. All right, moving on to the next illustration. He says, okay, let's go with this idea that this is nothing more than an instinct. Okay, well, if there's nothing driving us but just pure instinct, then why is it that the stronger instinct doesn't win every single time? So let's say I'm hungry. I've got this instinct to feed myself, to be greedy, to not share. So why is it oftentimes that people give in to the weaker one? They share their food. It should be ding, 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 and the winner is the stronger instinct. Be greedy. Only look out for yourself. But that is not the case. And in fact, he points out, oftentimes the opposite is true. The weaker instinct, the one that we're like, I don't really want to, but I really should, I guess. You wouldn't possibly, if these are two competing instincts, you would not ever expect the weaker instinct to win out. It doesn't make sense. The only way it does make sense is if this is more than just an instinct, if it's some absolute rule outside of us, like God's law, that compels us, that says, no, it doesn't matter how you feel, you need to help. Even if you would prefer to stay safe and dry and not have any risk, even though you would prefer just to eat the ice cream cone yourself, you need to share. It's important to share. Put yourself in their shoes, that type of thing. That's not instinct. That is an absolute truth or rule for life. And then the final example that he gives, let me cover up the bottom part, is if there was a morality instinct, one that we could kind of point to, oh, that desire I have here, that is the kind of absolute moral right thing. It should always point us in the right direction then. If it truly is just an instinct, then that instinct should never point us in the wrong way, and yet it regularly does, because there is no earthly rule that we can follow in all situations that is always right. So we look at things like, is it good for parents to love their kids? Absolutely. To be loyal, to defend, to protect, to take their side, yes. That is a good thing. But what if your child commits armed robbery or murders someone? Well, there are plenty of parents that will actually call the police and turn them in. Why? Because while this is good to a point, there does come a point where you have to kind of maybe not throw it out the window, but there's a bigger truth than just the be loyal to your family, to defend them, protect them. It includes doing what's right. Or what about, okay, it's important that we obey authority. Maybe our parents, our pastors, our teachers, governors, presidents, police officers, that type of thing. Yes, that's true, but what if they ask you to do something that is immoral, that is wrong? Well, then we aren't supposed to obey them. Peter and John made this point to the Sadducees, or the Sanhedrin, the Jewish Sanhedrin. They said, look, what would you have us do? Should we obey you, or should we obey God? And they weren't asking for an answer because they didn't know. They said, put yourselves in our shoes. We have to listen to God. We're not trying to be disrespectful or disobedient, or we're not rejecting your authority for no good reason. We feel God compelling us to continue teaching about Jesus, and so we're going to. What about honesty? Honesty is a good policy. It's the best policy. But that doesn't mean you just tell the truth brutally or in a cruel way. But I told the truth. I don't care if they're crying. I told the truth. Well, yes, but there's a good way to tell the truth and to be honest, and there is an unnecessarily cruel, harsh, brutal way. And the Bible also talks about this in Proverbs, using a little bit of honey to make the truth a little bit easier for someone to swallow. So the fact that we can't point to one of these instincts and it's just always unquestionably right and just guides us clearly every single time in all situations, that tells us it's not an instinct that we can just harness and figure out how to take advantage of. No, there's some moral law or code outside of us, greater than us, bigger than us. And again, as a Christian, he's going to eventually point to the Bible and to God, to Jesus. But he's not there yet, and he's, again, taking this incrementally to help people work through this. Again, the whole reason that we are going over Mere Christianity is to address these different worldviews, so that when you leave unity and go on, and you get confronted with these other worldviews, or someone questions your worldview, you can say, no, I have thought this through logically, step by step, and I have seen that Christianity is the only way to view the world that is consistent and makes sense. And so I have an explanation. When I am confronted with hard times, like right now with the coronavirus, or someone close to you dying, or something like that, you can take comfort in knowing, look, I've looked through these options, and I know these are the two options. I can either go to heaven or hell, and I know how to go to heaven and how to not go to hell. And so I can take that knowledge and have peace for myself, and I can pass that peace on to others as well. And so in the midst of uncertainty and craziness, there is a huge comfort that comes from knowing, like, wow, as a believer, like, I believe this, truly believe this. There's nothing that can hurt me. I don't have to be scared. So again, let's not lose focus of why we are studying this book. So, morality, he's saying, this argument just doesn't fly. Herd instinct, no. Morality, the morality that I'm talking about, is not just an instinctual thing that we just kind of feel. No, it is outside of us. All right, what about society brainwashing us, tricking us into thinking that moral absolutes exist, but really they don't. It's just what all of society, the majority or the consensus, has come to reach. Well, let's look at that now. So he's saying, okay, what Christians call morality, this is what the critics say, you're really just describing the opinion of the majority of people in a given society. Maybe the whole world, maybe just in the United States or just in the Midwest. But since we're taught that, this right and wrong, from our parents, our teachers, movies, government, that type of thing, really it's not this absolute morality truth. You're just describing what we've had, smashed into our heads since we were born. So if society, though, wanted to, kind of the point that they're getting at is, if society really wanted to, we could all agree to change our definitions of right and wrong, and that would be okay now. And they'll commonly point to something like slavery. They'll say, look, society used to say that slavery was okay. That was the norm. And I would point that out and say, okay, so was that then? If society can just agree to change things, and that's all that morality is, there isn't a true moral absolute that exists apart from us in our opinions, then you're arguing that slavery actually was okay? Or that it's not bad? And then things can start falling apart pretty quickly. Like, well, no, I'm not arguing that. Well, you kind of are. If there is no absolute moral truth, then who's to say that murder is bad? Or that Adolf Hitler wasn't the good guy in World War II? That doesn't make sense. You can't say that someone is good or bad if there is no standard that people have to attain. This also, kind of the next point that C.S. Lewis makes is, you're ignoring the fact that just because we're taught something doesn't mean that it's arbitrary, just kind of randomly picked and could have been something different. He said there's kind of two things that we get taught. There are simple factual absolutes, And then there's another thing, kind of the opinion-based things that could have been something different. So I have a sort of quiz. So what things in this box down here would be considered maybe absolutes, or these are just facts? Let me switch the background there so it pops a little bit more. So the truths of mathematics. 1 + 1 = 2. He said, well, that is kind of an absolute. It doesn't matter that your parents or teachers taught you that. That doesn't make it less true or less absolute. And granted, we could have called 2 7. We could have just put a different title with the numbers, but the basic principles of math are still absolute. Whether society recognizes them or not, there is a pattern, a design to the world that is described by math. So here, math terminology, though, that could have been different. We could have called a triangle a rhombus. We could have called a circle a rectangle, or an elephant. And so the terms, the names that we gave things could be different, but the rules behind math aren't changing. They are absolute. Or to put it differently, something like a square has 90-degree angles. Okay, that wasn't something that humans just invented. I mean, they invented the terminology. We're going to call something an angle, and we're going to call this type of angle a 90-degree angle. Those terms were created, but they didn't create the truth, the system of math. They discovered it. What about the idea of that it's rude to burp? Okay, now some people might disagree, but that is not a moral absolute. In some cultures, in fact, it's considered very polite to burp. It's a sign that your meal was delicious, that it was good. So, yeah, chewing with your mouth open, that's another one that could fall in the opinion category. A lot of social etiquette rules are really matters of opinion. I've heard of some societies that are disgusted and grossed out that that some people at least, blow their nose into a handkerchief and then put that handkerchief in their pocket. They said, that's disgusting. Why would you do that? That's gross. That's awful. That's wrong. Well, yeah, that's a cultural opinion that could be different. What about 8 planets in our solar system? Now, that might seem like a fact, but really, the kind of firing Pluto from among the planets shows that really our definition of planet could be different. Our definition of solar system could be different. So that's something that actually could change. We could have more than 9 or 8 planets, and we could have fewer than 8 planets. We could have the solar system we have now, or we could have a smaller or bigger one, depending on how we define it. And similarly, continents. Are there 7 continents? This is something that is actually actively argued. Some people say, why are we dividing North and South America into 2 different continents? Well, because we defined continent as big landmass that's mostly surrounded by water. It's like, okay, I can maybe see that. It's still technically connected, or at least it was until the Panama Canal. But then someone will point to, like Europe and Asia. Why are those separate continents? It doesn't even get skinny between Europe and Asia. It's very thick there. That doesn't make any sense at all. And what is the cutoff for something being a continent? Okay, Australia is big enough to be its own continent, but not Greenland? So these are things that could have been different. These are not absolutes. 24 hours in a day. There's no rule. There's no absolute truth that says there has to be 24 hours in a day. We could have had a different system, or 60 minutes in an hour. We could have changed that. Being kind to others, this is not an opinion. This is something that we are supposed to do. This is just kind of a moral absolute truth that kind of all societies recognize this is important, to be kind to other people. Now, societies might disagree as to who those other people that you're supposed to be kind to are. And that's kind of the point of Jesus's parable of the Good Samaritan. Who do I have to love? Who do I have to be kind to? And Jesus says, everybody, even your enemy is your neighbor. You know, a Jew and a Samaritan, they are enemies. They don't get along. They don't like each other. And yet this Samaritan understood this truth of God's, that you are to be kind to everyone. But even if a society doesn't accept this, they're still recognizing the basic principle that it's important to be kind. And maybe they're wrong on who the others are that you need to be kind to, but they're still recognizing this truth, this absolute. Helping the poor, this is another one that we are required to do. And all societies kind of recognize, okay, it's important that we look out for maybe just poor family members, just poor people in your neighborhood, maybe just poor citizens of your country. Maybe it's everyone. But again, there's still that principle of we should help people, at least some people who are disadvantaged, have something going against them. Giving money to the poor, that's not necessarily the way, because there were times when money, coinage, didn't even exist. Maybe it's not actually helping the poor to give them money. Maybe you need to give them a job. Maybe you need to give them food. So that would be one that could fall into this area. Even though a society, or maybe you are taught, we need to give money to the poor, the truth of helping the poor is absolute, but you don't necessarily have to give money to do that. That's not always going to be helpful, especially if a poor person is going to use that to get alcohol or drugs. Graduating after 12th grade. A lot of people just kind of take this for granted. You always go to school until you're a senior in high school, and then you graduate, and then you go to college for 4 years maybe, or you go to school for about 180 days, and you always have the summer off. Well, why? That's just an opinion. That's something that, for a variety of reasons, we have done, and much of the world has done, but not all of the world. And it could have been different. This is not an absolute. So this is the point that C.S. Lewis is getting at. Just because we are taught some things doesn't mean that they are just matters of opinion. And he says, here's another way, well, I think a more compelling way even. Okay, maybe this was a little bit weird and you're like, I'm just not understanding why that's a big deal. I think this will definitely make sense. He said, okay, do you consider every single culture, their value system or their morality, their definitions of good and evil, right and wrong, do you consider them all to be exactly equivalent, all the same? Or are there better cultures? And I think, again, a way to really separate it quickly is, were the Nazis just as good or just as bad as, and then you fill in the blank. Were the Nazis just as good as the United States is now? Were the ancient Romans just as good as modern-day Brazil? Is the Taliban's rule in Afghanistan just as good and moral as Japan today? I thought this was interesting. There's a research organization called Pew Research, and in 2011 they polled people during the spring of 2011, and they asked people in the United States, in Germany, Spain, Britain, and France, do you think your culture, your nation's culture, is maybe not perfect, but better than others? And 49% of the United States said yes. Now, just 9 years earlier, in 2002, 60% of the United States said absolutely the United States is better than any other place. This is less common in Europe. And it's becoming less common just kind of worldwide. People are becoming more cynical. But I think this is silly. And people get up in arms if you were to say something like the society in Saudi Arabia where up until recently it was illegal for women to drive, and the punishment for women driving would be to be whipped, flogged. That society, that culture, their system, their values were just as good as the United States's. And oftentimes the people who are the loudest critics of this kind of perspective, that the US might be better, its culture, than another cultures, they are the ones who will support views that Saudi Arabia condemns. Like they will be for women's rights, even a right to like an abortion, or the right for a homosexual couple to marry. Things that Saudi Arabia disciplines extremely severely. So it's a little bit bizarre. But I think deep down inside, people still recognize, even if they aren't willing to admit it, they still recognize that this is true, that there are some cultures where their value system, their morals are better than another cultures. Not perfect. Certainly the United States has issues. Maybe not even the best, but superior to other cultures. And here were two other results of this same research poll that I thought kind of had some bearing with this unit, or this chapter. Morality and belief in God. Is it necessary to believe in God to be moral? And overwhelmingly, when compared to the other nations, the United States says yes. Over half of our country says yes, you need to believe in God to have a good grasp of morality, to live a moral life. And that is far less common in Europe, which makes sense because far fewer of them believe in God. And kind of tied to that, how many of you consider yourself a United States citizen first and foremost versus a Christian first and foremost? And it was evenly split. About half and half of the nation considers themselves a Christian first or an American first. In Germany, 70% of Germany considers themselves a German citizen first, and only 23% consider themselves a Christian first. And look at France. 90% say I'm French before anything else. Only 8% say, yeah, I'm a Christian. That's more important to my identity than anything else. And again, this is going to drastically shape your concept of morality. So what C.S. Lewis is not saying is that he's not saying that society doesn't shape the morality, the moral views that we hold. He's just saying that that doesn't change the fact that there is, outside of our society, outside of our herd, there is this idea of right and wrong that it doesn't change. It doesn't go away with the majority. Or one last way to look at it, was what Adolf Hitler did in Nazi Germany good because he convinced a majority of the nation to go ahead with it, to follow what he was doing, whether they liked it or not? They fought in his war. They built the camps. They were cruel to a number of people groups. Was that okay? And I don't think anyone, if they're being completely honest, would say yes. And C.S. Lewis says, okay, if you agree, yes, that was just wrong, then you have agreed that there is an objective morality outside of people. And from there, we'll move on to chapter 3, what to do with that.